Three, two, one. Welcome to the David the Dog Trainer Podcast, episode 195. Let's try to get our guest on here. I appreciate you coming on.
No, man, thank you.
I think this is gonna make a pretty interesting conversation. We get a lot of people that, message us about topics we're talking about, and, I'll have a little bit of back and forth with them here and there. And very infrequently is there people that have stuff to kind of back what they're saying and have the knowledge to be able to kind of support, different claims or topics they're trying to talk about and stuff like that. And it was just very apparent when you messaged me, 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, whatever it was, that obviously you know what you're talking about. So anytime I run into situations like that, I always say I'm always interested to kind of dive into those topics more and kind of see where the conversation takes us. Obviously, in a minute, I want to give you the opportunity to kind of introduce yourself to everybody. But I just want to really quickly give everybody just the backstory on, where, obviously this conversation was derived from. So obviously we had been talking about the NAPOPO training and the concepts of using e-collars as activation versus, punishment versus negative reinforcement, et cetera, et cetera. And you had messaged me kind of, basically talking about how you were playing with it a little bit and trying to kind of make sense of some of the ideas. We kind of had a friendly little back and forth, discussing, again, the concepts of activation. Is it possible? Is it just negative reinforcement that's just being fluffed wordage wise? That turned into obviously talking about, conditioning punishment markers and all sorts of stuff like that. We just kind of figured this actually probably would just make a really good episode. So let's just talk about it live here.
For sure.
So
for sure.
Here we are now, obviously. I don't know what we're going to talk about, but I got a bunch of notes from the stuff you sent me, obviously. We'll just dive into shit and kind of see what happens.
That's super cool.
But without further ado, why don't you go ahead and kind of introduce yourself to everybody? Tell everybody a little bit about what you do from a training standpoint, as well as obviously you are studying, psychology and stuff like that. So I'm personally curious to hear a little bit more about all of that.
Fair enough. So, hi, everyone. My name is Leandro Aragon. Little backstory, little stuff about me. So, technically German born, but I grew up moving a ton. So, I lived in, I think, 6 different countries when I was a kid, just because of my mom's work. And so, I'm bilingual by nature. So, English, Spanish, because of my parents' background, and then German, obviously, at some point as well. I had to sort of relearn that. Sort of a diverse background, because dog training is something we could argue relatively new in my life. I've been doing it the last 4 years. Roughly around COVID, I was like, I was working in clubs as a DJ and sort of in the music industry and stuff. And I was like, wow, this whole thing is kind of burning me out. Let me see what else I can do with my life. And I was also not interested in going to a normal university whereby if it shuts down, I'm fucked, right?
Yeah.
So I decided to study online. I'm actually studying in Grand Canyon University. It's in Arizona. Mm-hmm. And in May, I technically graduate finally after 5 years.
Very cool.
So yeah, dog training background. I just got into it all of a sudden. This thing is kind of crazy, actually. I kind of got into it first from the sports world first. Just kind of curious as to how do people do all this stuff? It's really impressive when you really break it down and you think they can't use punishment or rewards during the session in which they're, participating. They're being judged not only on the actual performance of the dog, but the overall look and aesthetic of it too. And you can really sort of see where stuff sort of breaks down, and it's been really interesting just on that standpoint for me. That's kind of where I got into it at first. And I think that informs a lot of the sort of work I do. I work mostly with pets, but I always try to bring, let's say, sports concepts into what I do, right? So how would this look like from a sports perspective, or even just, for example, most of my dogs that end up being off leash, they all have a contact heel, which I took from French ring. I'm like, dude, if they can just contact heel everywhere and they clearly have a desire to go bite the decoy, and there's tons of distractions, or even in PSA where they're just throwing water bottles at the dog and all kinds of shit. Why can't we do the same in the city? Here in Barcelona, where I live, dude, you have so many dogs, so many crazy people, homeless people, garbage trucks, this, that, the other. And for me, it's like, dude, we're basically in the competition the whole time
Yeah.
in the city. So it's like, why not combine both worlds? Um, the last, so I've been doing this professionally now for almost 5 years. And the last 3 years, I've been just doing basically word of mouth stuff. So whoever has been my client before, either they like it or they don't. Clearly they do. So they recommend me and I just get job off of that. And then over time, I was like, look, we could probably start a brand and sort of start taking it a bit more, let's say, professionally in that sense. Like actually have a presence online and stuff like this, put out videos. And yeah, that's where we are now. And that's why this is here. And the whole idea behind Merge is basically, yeah, that's like connecting human psychology and dog psychology, connecting the sports world and the pet world and sort of, again, just making a mix of those two and seeing what the best possible outcome is from both of those.
Yeah, I love that. So clearly, I mean, I feel like your knowledge of the psychology side of things is that of somebody far more experienced than 4 years in an industry, right? Like, I feel like you have a very good, and that could just be you've been studying it now, coming up on 5 years, right? So it's a very intensive of approach to that, obviously. But it feels like to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but your understanding and your kind of thrive to learn about psychology and stuff probably came before the dog training stuff. Is that correct?
I'd say it kind of grew all together simultaneously. Yeah. Because at some point when you're doing dog work, you're also looking into our background in psychology as well and how those two kind of connect. And also the simple fact that at the end of the day, we're training people, right? Yeah. So, I mean, here, for example, in Barcelona, I wish it was a bit different in that sense that we could do more boarding and training like you guys in the States, where you basically just work the dog. Then you inform the client, hey, this is what we did. This is how you keep it up. And this is the steps you have to do, keep on taking moving forward. For us, it's literally just like, or the majority of trainers here in Barcelona and in Spain in generally, I'd say it's a lot of one-on-one stuff, right? So you might get some old lady who is like just a bit anxious about everything. They're like, oh my God, this other dog is going to come up to my dog, and they get all tense, and we have to sort of work them through that as well, right? Not only the dog. And so I'm always kind of going back and forth. It's like human psychology. How can I help my clients reach their best potential? And how can I help the dogs? Yeah. Right. So I'm always sort of doing both at the same time.
Yeah. So what drove you to start getting the degree then? So did the degree come at the same time? Were you like, I'm interested in getting into dog training and I want to learn as much as I can about the psychology thing. So I'll study that.
I see your question.
Yeah.
Got it. So, funny enough, so cause I've had a very varied past. I've been skateboarding for like 15 years or so. And at some point, I had a couple of like, I think you mentioned this in another podcast that you would have skated back in the day when you were younger, right?
Oh yeah.
Do you know like the sort of steps, like the hierarchy of like flow, pro, this sort of stuff?
Very, very minimally. It's been a long time. So,
for me, it feels the same, bro. I haven't skated in like 3 years or something now.
Oh gosh, it's been probably like 15 for me. So yeah, it's been a while. Yeah.
But anyway, so I was like in that whole world. And then when the Olympics came around and skateboarding was part of the Olympics, I was like, holy shit, we could actually be doing psychology for sports. And that's where it was really interesting to me at first. And I found this degree, which was psychology with a specialization in sports psychology.
Understood.
So that's actually the background.
Okay. Yeah. So that makes sense, obviously. And that brings, again, the study and interest of that kind of stuff to pre-dog training, which, makes sense for, like I said, it's very infrequent. When you're learning about dog training, it's really hard to like start off so strong where it's like, I'm like intensely studying psychology. I'm intensely studying these methods. I'm intensely studying how to, teach my clients better and handle the dogs and things like that. So that makes sense to me. So that's cool. Yeah, I mean, listen, a couple of things you brought up right off the rip that I just want to touch on because I think they're really important points. You mentioned, obviously, your interest in the sport world, coming from, there were kind of two key points. One was when you're training for competition, you have to train in a way where you can't actively use like punishment and reward in your trials, obviously. And I think when people are getting involved in training, a lot of people start off in the sport world. And I think that it could help you or hurt you. It could help you from the standpoint of there's a lot of key takeaways from the sport world that could really apply to the pet dog training and help you out quite a bit. And one of the big ones is exactly that, is how do we train in a way where we're not contingent on the actual use of the punishment and the reward consistently over and over and over again in order to achieve our desired outcomes. And that's why you see so many trainers that are constantly needing to utilize the e-collar or utilize the pinch collar, and their dogs aren't responsive just to verbal commands, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which I think is a big missing link people have a hard time connecting that the sport world forces you to be able to do, which is great, obviously. And then the other one was you talked about, obviously, the use of like a contact heel you took from French ring. So my background in the sport world was in Mondio ring, so very similar, obviously, to French ring. And yeah, I remember the contact heel was one of the first places where I was like, damn, like your dog doesn't need to look at you all the time. Like your dog can be 100% responsive to your command and direction when out and about while still looking at other things and taking in other things. And then this idea that like, you know, you're going to go out on the trial field and in these cases where you're about to send your dog on a bite, you're going to have your dog willingly and wanting to just not look at that decoy all the time. Like obviously it's a possible thing to teach. You do have to teach it in some concepts and some disciplines of obviously protection sports, but like they don't have to, you know, if you allow them to be able to look sometimes at certain triggers and stuff, that doesn't automatically mean that they're going to do something with it or you're going to lose control over them or anything like that. So I think those are two really interesting things. And then you mentioned obviously using that contact healing, just walking out and about and having a little bit looser of a parameter on things. And I couldn't agree more with those things. Those are really really big points that I think two of them that really helped shape a lot of my pet dog training was seeing those things being used in the sport dog community. So I think that's
how
really
hard.
cool.
Can I ask you, how hard do you find that to translate, say, a contact heel for a regular client?
Well,
So that's something they want necessarily, or
I don't want to say I teach a contact heel, right? So to everybody that's listening that don't know what a contact heel is, literally you're training the dog to, you know, stay with you in what looks like a heel position, but their reference point is that they're literally touching you, right? So they're making contact with your leg as they're moving around, so they don't need to look at you in order to see where you're at because they can feel where you're at, right? We don't train exactly that, right? I don't ever set an expectation that dogs need to touch us, but what it shaped for me is this idea that it doesn't need to be this rigid, perfect heel, right? I think a lot of trainers put a little bit too much emphasis on like left-hand side, shoulder in line with your leg, dog checking in with you and looking up, right? And they try to look at all that kind of stuff and create this unnecessarily strict and complex expectation on the dog that becomes really hard to enforce long-term. Right? Because the more
if you think about it too, like people in trial, they're doing like excessively, they're just going over and over and over again. Like let's say a left turn. If your dog is forging ever so slightly in a left turn, you're just going to do left turns for a month or like 2 months before your trial. You're just fine tuning that all to the nth degree, right?
Yeah.
It's not something clients can just uphold.
Exactly. And particularly with your healing exercises, like in French ring and Mondio ring and you know, PSA, IPA, all that kind of stuff. Like obviously a strict focused heel is an expectation that, they will work on fixing that forging with all these complex different things. But like, I remember the very first time I went to a trial and watched some of the dogs, you know, that were going for their level 3. And some of these dogs actually went on to compete in top 10 in the world and stuff. And you watch them doing their contact heel and it's like, it's not really a pretty heel. Like a lot of these dogs are kind of like crabbing behind you a little bit, forging in front and this and that, but they're staying with you fine and they're completely under control. And most owners can't even achieve that expectation with their dogs. So it just kind of opened my mind to like, if we can make these parameters a little looser, it becomes easier to enforce long-term, which creates less stress for the dog, which creates less stress for the human, which creates a more enjoyable experience when you're out and about walking. So that's kind of how it shaped me, if you will, as far as how I teach a lot of my walking positioning to dogs.
To add a little bit to that, I think when I look at, so for example, someone from IGP would be like, Mondio, French, or Belgian ring healing is shitty.
Yeah, 100%.
It's unpretty.
It is unpretty and compared. Like you take any of those dogs and you try to put them in and try to get, you know, whatever, some sort of title in one of the other sports. Like they're obviously not going to pass with flying colors. It is not what they want to see. So yeah,
but then
absolutely.
Again, a French ring contest or a French ring, the healing portion plus all the protection work, etc., all that is roughly an hour of duration,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So your dog has to also learn to pace itself.
Yes.
Versus in IGP, your dog's just like looking up at fucking nothing.
Yeah.
For maybe max 20 minutes, right? So they can, like, in terms of output, they could do it, right?
So the time, right? Yeah. So obviously, like Mondio 3, yeah, same deal, like 45 minutes to an hour usually for an entire routine. But past that, the choreography of the other sports, it's the same thing every time. Right. So you're training essentially a dance routine where it becomes more predictable for the dog. They don't have to guess as much. They're not utilizing as much mental stimuli, if you will. So yeah, they don't gas out on those things and can perform it much more easily than at that point. So yeah, 100%. And that's case in point example. That's why I like that. Also, I got into Mondio, and I'm sure you feel the same about French, is the lack of predictability and the amount you need to focus on like generalization and stuff when you're training those pictures is real life. Right. Like I remember when we were training retrieves and this and that, it was like we would go to the club and it'd be like, what kind of random picture are we going to come up with today to train for? Because it could be anything when you go to the trial field, obviously. And when you open your front door and go out into the real world, you don't know what the picture is going to be either. So the more you work on like one very specific one, that doesn't really help you in all the other contexts that you need. So yeah,
Exactly.
100%.
I like to think of, in an ideal world, the way we should train both pets and competition dogs is just make them as smart as they can be, potentially.
And
right?
what do you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that? I think I know what you mean, but you know.
So you could, let's break it down. So you could technically train in a way where it's predictable. This means this cue means this, whatever. Dog coming your way means XYZ behavior pattern that you must follow through with. And if you don't, then you get punished or you get reinforced. You could do it that way and it's very predictable. Or you could take a little bit longer, make it a bit harder on everyone, including the dog yourself, the whole process, and teach your dog different solutions to different stimuli in the environment. Or like you were talking about earlier with the contact heel, what does the contact heel actually imply? Does it mean touch me with your neck? Does it mean touch me with your shoulder? Does it mean touch me with your ribs? Right? Like, can you be permissive about that? Can the dog just understand, like, oh, I just need a touch, doesn't matter how I'm touching, right? This sort of stuff. Like, I'm curious, depending on how you train, how smart, like when I say smart, I really mean like, can your dog figure stuff out for itself? Does that make sense?
Kind of. So yeah. I when I say I think I understand what you're saying with it, I think I think what you're kind of implying is like showing the dog many different pictures, but also asking them to do a little bit more of the work, right? So you mentioned as you're training this contact heel, instead of giving so much help to show them like shoulder, body, this, that, like creating a parameter. And well, actually, I guess my confusion by that is still, even the examples you described of can the dog figure it out feel to me like you're just asking the dog to figure out a different set of expectations that you're creating in that moment, I guess, right? But there's still, and this kind of starts tying into the conversation we're having, I understand. There's still contingent on, you know, some type of reinforcement or punishment in order to help guide them through that decision making, right?
Right.
So am I understanding you correctly there?
Yeah, for sure. If I could add, I think I'd say this is sort of maybe like a sticking point we might get into.
Well, this is this is kind of the segue, I think, because like I know like a lot of like what you sent me as far as like some of the studies and things like that are challenging some of the modern views of learning theory. Right. So this is actually perfect that we can kind of start to segue into that here now at this point. Go ahead. You were going to add something to it, though. Yeah.
I guess it's a big question.
Let's do it.
Can be a bit confusing, also depending. Well, let me just ask it. So, do you think dogs have free will?
No.
Tell me more.
Well, so the idea of them having free will would mean, and let me pull up the definition before we like get super into this. I like to make sure we're working off of the same definitions here. So free.
Also, let's try for the people watching if we can go back and forth and try also dumbing it down, not because the people watching are dumb, but just so we can make like a a normal sort of thing where we all understand what we're talking about. Because if we talk about really technical terms,
Yes.
a lot of people might lose interest,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So they're like, oh, what are these guys talking about?
100%. Okay, so we got free will here. So here's the definition. Free will is often understood as the ability to choose between different courses of action, to make choices that are not determined by prior causes or external forces. So would you agree with that definition?
Yeah.
For the most
Yeah,
part?
makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. So,
And mind you, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, you're
There's
fine.
huge debates as well about whether humans have free will or not.
yes, yeah, for sure. I've definitely
Right, so-
heard some of that. Again, this is not, to be clear also, this is not my area of expertise, is getting super philosophical with a lot of these things, but I really enjoy these conversations. So here's my thoughts, right? I think the biggest difference between humans and dogs is that no matter what, dogs are all like I like to use the example when people like shit on crates and say like, oh, why would you lock your dog up? And I always tell them, I was like, your house is a giant crate, right? No matter what, when you leave home, you're not just leaving your door open and your front gate open and truly giving the dog the ability to make every decision that they could possibly make with the hopes that we've trained them properly and that they're going to be wise enough in order to make the proper decisions and not run away, get themselves into trouble, come back to us, go seek something else out, leave the home and go create their own life and family and all these types of things. I think no matter what, we as humans, dogs are always going to be contingent on the direction we're giving them. Whether they're capable of having that free will or not, I think is a separate conversation. But I don't think anybody that owns a dog ever puts the dog truly in a position where they have that. So that's my thoughts on it, I would say.
You mean like where they can properly exercise it?
Yes, correct.
That is without influence of the handler, right? External influence, whether it be from us, from whatever.
We will always be providing some degree of influence, and it's going to be that of more than, I think the debate with humans, do humans have free will, is that these societal constructs that are out there are basically governing us to some extent, right? And not allowing us to fully exercise our free will as well. I just think that when it comes to the human-dog relationship, humans have a much stronger sense of control over dogs than those societal realms and stuff may have over us as humans.
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. I bring up the free will thing because if we think about behaviorism, right? So Skinner is a behaviorist. So is Pavlov. Before behaviorism came to be, psychology was working in a sort of more so philosophical realm, right? The whole idea behind behaviorism was to find a way to implement the scientific method into psychology so that psychology could become a science, so to speak, right? So back then, philosophy, and I think even to this day, philosophy, you wouldn't regard it at the same level as, say, the study of biology, right? It's very esoteric.
Sure.
Right? It's very up here, very theoretical stuff.
Sure.
Right? So that was the big sort of push that the behaviorists had back then, was to sort of find new ways to look at what we do in psychology and how we look at organisms, specifically in this case, how do we get to the human component, so that we can study it as a science properly and the psychology could be taken more seriously, right?
Sure.
So dualism came before behaviorism, and behaviorism is an opposing theory to dualism. Dualism sort of dictated that brain and body are two separate things. So inside our brain, there is unlimited free will and different sort of mental processes going on. And this is one thing, and the body is separate, right? We now know with neuroscience, much later on in the development of all this, that the brain and the body function together. It's not like they're two separate entities, right?
Sure.
Nonetheless, behaviorists try to figure out, okay, well, if the brain and the body are two separate things, that can't be true, because you can be angry, for example, and show signs of anger, meaning you're both working together. You can't just have mental without physical, right? Like, let me see if I can find the what was his name? Man, bear with me. I think I have like 200 pages of notes.
You're 100% fine.
Right. So Descartes, he's the first one to sort of explain dualism.
Can you, so you said the dualism is because I'm not super familiar with that. Is that the brain and body working independently thought? Okay, got it.
Yep. So let's see if I can't find you a proper definition of. So dualism argues that the mind and body are separate substances. The mind is immaterial while the body is physical. The mind is seen as the source of thoughts, consciousness, and free will, while the body operates mechanically. This is a top-down approach. The mind controls behavior, right?
Sure.
Which is different from what the behaviorists were thinking back then. And they were rejecting the idea of an independent, immaterial mind. They thought that they treated behavior, including thoughts and emotions, as observable and measurable physical processes, right? So before, like I was saying, philosophy, everything is up here, right? Mind separate from body, everything is up here.
Yep.
And the behaviorists were like, well, how do we measure that, right? Ergo, Pavlov, Skinner, etc. And they sort of sought out to see how exactly can we measure whether the brain and the body are working together or not, right? I think this is really fun sort of background info from a historical standpoint and from just a technical standpoint, so we can understand how did we get to where we are now, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Feel free to. Am I making myself clear?
Yeah. Continue, obviously.
So basically, what they ended up coming up with, right, is that the behaviorists, that is, they end up coming up with the fact that the environment is what influences the mind, which is what influences the body altogether, right?
Yes.
And that's where it's not like we haven't really left that model altogether. We're still there. It informs a lot of what we still do. And I mean, there's branches of psychology like cognitive behaviorism and so forth that sort of look at this sort of stuff. And it's not like we haven't thrown out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yeah.
It still informs a lot of psychology today. But in terms of humans, for example, and human learning, behaviorism has kind of fallen by the wayside.
Yeah, sure.
We've sort of over time figured out like, we can't really base everything on previous reinforcement histories and so forth.
Yes, sure.
That doesn't just work that way, like in a vacuum.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is obviously it started with, things are separate, right? You have actions, which are unrelated to like thoughts and what's going on from a higher standpoint, obviously like that. Then it transitioned from that to your environment obviously influences how you're thinking about things and how you're feeling about things, which influences obviously what you're doing with those things. So the physical actions and stuff you're taking, implying that environment, meaning the reinforcements, the punishments that you may experience in your day-to-day are the only things that are impacting what comes out on the other end, which is the behavior you're experiencing. And that's what we want to challenge ultimately. Am I understanding that correct? Okay.
Roughly speaking, yeah. Yeah.
So I think we definitely agree with that. So, I'll be honest, like some of the articles and stuff you sent, I didn't read all the way because like there was one that was like 100 pages or something like that. Yeah. So I skimmed it obviously, but I did skim through all the things you sent. And one of the big things that stood out to me, which I was like, oh, this is something we're absolutely going to agree on, was the whole Watson's theory thing, right? So I very briefly watched that video, obviously. I've definitely heard of it before. So I don't know all the inner workings and details of it. But basically the idea was he was following the same philosophy that environment dictates everything. So I put down here like nature versus nurture. In his mind, it was basically nurture is everything. You could turn a child into whatever you want the child to ultimately be based on how you impact the environment around them. I think, to me, where things got lost was it didn't I put here, like, obviously it does not factor in genetic predispositions. Behavior is created through reinforcement and punishment, but genetics impact how the individuals respond to those types of things. So I always say when people ask, is it nature or nurture? It's like, it's kind of a hybrid, because we can't deny, obviously, that the reinforcements and the punishments are going to dictate the behaviors that we see, but different. We'll just talk in the case of dogs, obviously, because this is a dog podcast, but in the case of dogs, there are dogs that are more genetically predisposed to be reinforced or punished or whatever by different things, motivated by different things, obviously. They're going to respond to their environments in different ways. And though you still need to figure out what the right combination of reinforcement and punishment is going to be in order to help achieve the end goal that you want, every dog is going to be a little bit different with that, and you can't follow too cookie cutter of an approach with it, which is the challenging the traditional learning theories. There is a little bit more to it than just apply something good, apply something bad, take away something good, take away something bad in order to do things. But I guess my question would be then, is it that traditional learning theory is wrong, or is there just another layer to it then at that point? I guess is where then I go with the conversation from there.
So I'm happy to jump to that point. Let me just finish something on Watson real quick.
Yeah,
because you said something in between that made me think of Watson again.
Yep.
Like you said, he thought that you could basically nurture any newborn child into becoming whatever it is that you desire them to become, right? Sure. If you remember yourself from that video, at the end, they talk about how he had 3 kids and he tried his approach on his 3 kids. Mm-hmm. And I think one of them did end up committing suicide. The other one was fully depressive. And the last one was an alcoholic.
Yeah. They didn't turn out very well.
It didn't turn out so well. Yeah. And not to mention that he was cheating on his wife with his research assistant the whole time. So, yeah. Shout out to him. To answer your question there, I think that the model we use currently, so let's say Skinner's quadrants, mm-hmm. Pavlov's classical conditioning, mm-hmm. they all make absolute sense, and we should not necessarily throw them out.
Yep.
Right? We shouldn't just say, hey, it's wrong. Where I do think we should look into is, well, as the name of it is, quadrant, right? It's neatly packaged into 4 quadrants. It's all really rigid.
Yeah.
How moldable, how flexible is that structure?
Yes.
So how can we benefit from making it as flexible as we can come up with?
Yeah. I agree, right? And so my question though, is it just that people, so another one of the articles that you sent over was, I don't remember exactly what it was called, but some of the notes that I have from it was like, one of the very first things in it was they were like, negative reinforcement needs a new term, because it's like people get so fucking confused by it. People get so confused. You say negative reinforcement, you just think something bad is happening. Everybody equates negative reinforcement to punishment. Mm-hmm. I've heard it from clients a million times. I've heard trainers explain it incorrectly a million times. When you try to explain it to a client, for whatever reason, negative reinforcement is one they just can't wrap their head around. It's just a really complicated topic, right? So with all of this, like the rigidity of the boxes, if you will, is the rigidity the problem? I don't even know if that's a word or not, but is the rigidity a problem? Or is it just that on an individual basis, all dogs and situations are going to fit differently within those 4 boxes? So one of the examples in that same article was like turning on a heat lamp, right? Is turning on a heat lamp, is the production of the heat, is it reinforcing? Is it positive reinforcement in that case? Or is the reduction of the cold, so the negative reinforcement, the primary reinforcer in that moment? And basically they're getting to, it's subjective to the one's experience in that moment, right? What are the other variables going on in the environment that are going to make the dog either reinforced by it because they're trying to access something, or reinforced by it because they're trying to avoid something? And this stemmed me to a funny thing. I remember I said one time, I was listening to a podcast, and, somebody said in it like, oh, positive reinforcement can be punishment or something like that. And I was like thinking about it, and just like, like half like being a smart ass, I was like, oh, well, like giving a food reward, is it the production of a satiation? Is it positive reinforcement in that moment? Or is it reducing hunger, and you giving your dog a treat is technically negative reinforcement in that moment?
I don't know if I go that far.
Well, yeah, obviously it's like I said, it's like a half joke, obviously a sarcastic thing. But like, if you really break it down, is that really that much difference than what they're explaining in the first example of subjective based on the experience? If you are like deathly hungry, like on the verge of starving, and somebody gives you some bread and you eat it, is that positive reinforcement in that moment? Or is that truly an example of negative reinforcement because of the extreme hunger that you're in that moment? And I think this is where, if people start looking at it just based on, so many people say, well, why don't you, like, how many times have you been working with a dog and the client says, well, why don't you pet the dog in that moment? And I'm like, well, you just assume petting the dog is positive reinforcement. But to a lot of dogs, when they're really nervous of a handler that they're working with initially, me petting them is absolutely not positive reinforcement in the moment.
They might even snap back at you.
Exactly, right? It actually could be considered punishment to them in that moment. It could be considered negative reinforcement depending on where I'm removing my hand in that moment, right? But it's still not changing the boxes, right? In my opinion, right? It's still not changing the quadrants that we're sitting within in that moment. It's just kind of looking at them a bit more deeply and looking at the things that you're doing to try to reinforce or deter behavior, and really asking yourself that honest question of what is at play right now? Which one are we truly utilizing in this exact moment? So I'll let you go. I'll let you go for a little bit now.
I have a question for you.
Yeah. Shoot.
So you say you condition a punishment marker, right? So no, the word no, right? In classical conditioning, this would mean no precedes, then punishment. Sufficient for the dog to be considerate punishment, obviously, right? So if
of course, yeah.
And this is also something we have to explain to clients often. It's like, yeah, just because we're using a prong collar, the simple fact of doing this isn't punishment just because it's a prong collar.
For sure.
Like the dog has to actually feel that was sufficient enough to cease the behavior it was just doing, right?
Yeah.
So you condition your punishment marker, no, right? And you keep on living your life, etc. You might use it every now and then, etc. Now, 7, 8 months down the line, a year down the line, your dog is off leash. It's going to go run up to another dog. You say no, and it comes back instead of going to the other dog. In that case, what is no? Is it negative reinforcement or positive punishment?
Did an actual punishment occur after the marker or not?
The example as I gave it, the dog just came back.
So it just came back when you said no?
Yep.
I feel that would be shifting the so when we utilize markers in general, right? So punishment markers, reward markers, things like that. I don't ever use them independently without the actual reinforcement on the back end, right? So I don't use like a no as a warning signal or anything like that says, hey, listen to it in this moment or else. Because if you were doing it that way, what would that? I mean, that would constitute then, would that be negative reinforcement then at that point? I mean, they're escaping, right? They're escaping the punishment, right? Technically at that point, right? But to me, they're unavoidable consequences. So it would still be punishment for me, the way that I utilize it, right? The expectation that I hold to my markers.
So this is what I was trying to say with making my dog smart. So because we use markers, and depending on how we use them, interchangeably or mixed with, so for example, what happens? Dog goes to the other dog. I say no. It doesn't go to the other dog. It comes back, and I feed it now. I play with the ball, right? Yeah. Now all three: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and positive punishment are at play in one single word.
Yeah.
And my dog technically can choose which route it's going to go.
Yeah.
Because it can say, oh, no, if I respond correctly to it, I can go back and get fed. I can also say, nah, fuck you, and see what happens, right? If you're using an e-collar at that point, fuck around, find out. Or he says, okay, and he doesn't go to the dog, but he doesn't come back to you either, right? So that'd be your negative reinforcement part of it.
Yeah.
But now we're making the dog think
Yeah.
further ahead than just reinforcement or not reinforcement or all of these. He now has a choice. I can go back to my owner. I can also not go to the dog, or I can say, meh, I'll go to the dog anyway and see what happens.
Sure.
Right?
Which I understand what you're saying. And I think a lot of this we're probably a little bit more aligned than it maybe sounds like in some of these situations, because I agree with you. I want to give my dog, like when I'm let's say disciplining unwanted behaviors, right? One of the big things I harp on with my clients and on the podcast and stuff like that is I always want to teach my dogs just to make choices, right? I'm not trying to prevent them from doing things by taking away all 100% of their free will, if you will, right? I want them to be able to make decisions, and I want to just be able to guide that decision making so that I could get closer to dogs having free will. Like I said, I still don't really believe they truly have it, but if I could put my dogs in a position where they just make good decisions, I could really, really skew things where 90% of their life they are making their own decisions, and the parameters that are being held to them are so loose that they're probably hardly even thinking about them most of the time, right? So like an example like that, like I'm out at the park, my dog goes to try to chase a squirrel or chase a dog or whatever it may be, right? And I tell them no, and I give them a correction for that. Yes, at that point, they do have the decision making to do whatever they want to do. Sure. I mean, if they think, oh, maybe I'll go back to dad because I might get a treat, or if they go, oh, all right, I'm not going to chase this dog, but I kind of want to smell this tree over here, so I'll go walk over there and do that. Maybe I'll come to a stop. Maybe I'll do that, right? Like they have all of these decisions they then can make at that point. That is obviously ultimately my goal. And then moving forward, I don't need to manage them with commands as much because they've learned in the future, I just don't do this thing. I could do anything else I want to do aside from this thing, right? So I don't know. I guess I don't.
It creates, to your point, you created a nice structure because, for example, if your dog is chasing behind a cat, would you rather recall it or just use your punishment marker?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would rather just tell them, hey, don't, like if I'm in the woods, if I'm doing an off-leash hike with my dogs, and every time they go to try to do something I don't want them to do, I'm contingent on making them come back to me and lay down and do this and get treats and all this kind of stuff. That is taking away from the overall experience of them being able to be free in that moment and go and enjoy themselves, right? So in that moment, by just communicating, nope, just don't do that thing right there, right? Do anything else, just don't do that thing. Yeah, it creates more ease of use for the handler, right? This is why I feel our clients are able to succeed a lot, is because we make things more simple for them. It's not as complex of an expectation you need to hold them to. That way you could keep them more successful with it, and the dogs can enjoy themselves more ultimately, right? So yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure.
I think for, let's just say normal pet training, the quadrants are enough, honestly. I think it's more than enough. You don't really need to mess with it too much. Because again, it's ease of access, right? The reason why we've kept using the quadrants and we don't really debate them is because they work to the sufficient amount in which we need them to, right? We say, okay, this behavior we don't want anymore, positive punishment gets rid of that behavior, right?
Yeah.
So it's pretty simple on that front. Where we started, when we started talking, when we first did our first DMs, was the concept of, can negative reinforcement training, so to speak, be also an activation thing, right?
Yeah.
Can you, in this case, like sort of what I was hinting at with the no marker, because in that case it's technically 3 options, right? You don't necessarily see suppression from the dog when you say no. In a physical sense, the dog's not like, oh shit, because it knows it has choices, right? And it can win. In this case, that then becomes negative reinforcement, and it wins on top of it because it can come back to you also. So it already has a learned escape mechanism, right? And that was sort of like, that's the sort of stuff I've been playing around with, is like, well, the use of language in our training helps dictate what the dog might feel and or do in response to a cue, right? So in this case, even though no is a commonly used suppressive cue that predicts punishment, why don't we see then necessarily suppression in a physical sense from the dog?
Depends how it's conditioned, I think, right? Because like for us, right, like we have conditioned in punish markers, right? Like when I say no to a dog, like, yeah, you see a visible sign as if they were getting corrected for something, right? So if you do hypothetically use it independent, let's say I do it that right, condition in word, right? No predicts this, no predicts this, no predicts this. Classical conditioning is at play if you're truly conditioning in a punishment marker, and you should see an aversive response from the dog when they hear that word, right? Now, a lot of times when I hear, like this may not be what you're suggesting, but what I'm understanding is, let's say in your example of saying no, you just said, obviously you say no, and you don't see that aversive response out of the dog. You don't see that suppression or whatever, if you will, obviously, but you see enjoyment then on the back end where they're coming back to you because of the option of getting a reward, right? Perhaps, right? Or maybe neutrality or whatever, but you're definitely not seeing suppression in that moment. That's where, and this was my whole debate with Kiba when I had him on, was, okay, let's say you started off by training it as a punishment marker, and there was at one point that suppressive response, that aversive response to that word. Can you over time recondition that word in to kind of get rid of some of that negative and in turn turn it into a bit more of a positive? Like, sure, but at that point, can you really just switch back and forth? Because then if you get that response out of it, you're not just going to automatically be able to switch back to using that word as a suppressive event as well. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yep. Makes complete sense. And actually, Skinner, when he was doing his experiments, he was doing it mainly with pigeons and rats.
Yep.
And he never used the same rat for positive punishment and negative reinforcement training.
Sure.
He never used the same one because he was scared of exactly that. He was like, well, if I do one or the other first, and actually then later the guy I sent you, Sidman, who was the one you were referencing before, where he was talking about, should we maybe change the definition of negative reinforcement? He was the one who later took that whole idea and looked into whether it does make a difference if you positively punish a subject first, what happens later with their perception of negative reinforcement, and what happens vice versa, right? He found out exactly that if you do positive punishment first, negative reinforcement is much harder to use appropriately with the same tool, because in that case, the subject is technically petrified of what's going to happen, right? You can't use a high-level punisher and then use a softer level and expect the subject in that case to still be proactive.
Yeah. So, okay.
Make sense?
Yes, here's my question, my follow-up question to that. So to me, when I look at positive punishment and I look at negative reinforcement, I think there is an automatic assumption of what you just said, which is positive punishment, higher, more intense aversive, negative reinforcement, softer, less intense aversive. Where to me...
Depends, right? Depends.
Sure, right? Like, but to me, negative reinforcement and positive punishment, the differentiation between the two has little, if nothing, to do with the intensity of the sensation. And it has everything to do with how that sensation is just being utilized in that moment. Does that make sense? Right. So obviously, if a dog jumps on somebody and I give them a correction for it, and that correction is in the moment aversive enough where the dog wants to avoid it moving forward, would that not be an example of punishment? I'm adding something to decrease the unwanted behavior. So they jump, I tap the e-collar, the dog jumps off of the person, obviously, because they were motivated enough by that e-collar. It has nothing to do with the fact that it was a really high level. It just had to do with the dog was motivated enough by that sensation, and that sensation happened in the exact moment that the dog went to rehearse the undesired behavior, right? Where in the case of negative reinforcement, let's say, whatever, I'm trying to teach the dog to get onto a bed, right? And whatever, let's just objectively say, this is the same training session, right? I just corrected the dog for jumping on that person. Now I press and hold the e-collar at that same level, help the dog on the bed, and then turn the pressure off when they get on that bed. The emphasis then is going to be on the release of pressure, right? So would that not be, would it not be just contingent on the application of it, not the level? Like, why do I have to have it lower for the negative reinforcement event than I do the punishment event? Isn't it just the dog is learning to either escape or avoid the sensation that they are ultimately motivated by, whatever level that winds up being. We know, obviously, there will be subjectively higher or lower numbers based on what it is we're working on, what environment we're in, how distracted the dog is, et cetera, but that is not the point. It's not a lower level that makes negative reinforcement, and punishment. It's just what the dog is motivated by in that moment and where the pressure either starts or turns off. That's what I mean by that.
I see what you mean. Do you think negative reinforcement can be looked upon in a spectrum? Would that make sense?
Just as punishment can be looked at in a spectrum. I agree.
Sorry, repeat that again?
Yes. Just as punishment can be looked at as a spectrum.
Oh, just as punishment can also be looked at. Okay, fair enough. So in that sense, like from 0 to 100, punishment, and also 0 to 100, negative reinforcement. And do they bleed into each other?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, negative reinforcement, you have the escape and avoidance side of things, obviously, which, at a certain point, does it flip into punishment in certain cases? And at certain points, does it flip into negative reinforcement? 100%. The example of jumping that I said, right? Like, we could argue that a dog jumping on the counter and me tapping the e-collar and that level being motivating enough that they jumped off, we could argue that that is an example of negative reinforcement as well, kind of.
Technically, right? Yeah.
Right?
You see where it starts getting messy?
That is a great example of where it can blur the lines a little bit. I 100% agree. And this is where
you could argue that, they're just being negatively reinforced off the counter.
100%. Yeah. Stimulation
at a
stops.
Higher degree of that.
Yes.
Spectrum.
Yeah. Stimulation stops when they get off the counter, technically, right? Because what would you do if the dog didn't get off when you did that? You would continue with pressure, which is an example of negative reinforcement at that point. So here's my question for you, right? So that is where it does get interesting, right? And I guess I do understand where you're saying where it does kind of bleed into the other. And this is, just to be clear, this is unrelated to the activation side of things. We're just talking, obviously, the use of aversives right now.
I think it's nice that we're doing it this way, because even though we're doing a quote unquote debate, I think we both agree on a lot of stuff, and the nice thing that we could do to come out of all this would be to come up with a solution.
So right? Far, I don't really see much that we disagree on yet, right? I'm sure we'll get to things, but for sure, this is where I think it's just. I think I even emailed you. We could loose debate, if you will, but this is just an interesting conversation of hey, let's dive a little deeper into some of these terminologies that we're using, obviously. So here's my question for you. So in the example of the heat lamp, right? Is it in the moment production of heat or reduction of cold? So positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. Both of those are reinforcement, right? So now we're talking the example of the counter, right? I give a correction. Is that an example of negative reinforcement, or is that an example of positive punishment? How do we then dictate the spectrum of subjectively in the moment? Is it reinforcing or is it punishing? Because all of these examples we talked about, I feel are examples of reinforcement, if flipping between two types of reinforcement. Do you get what I'm saying?
So I'll add something here. Technically, Skinner, when he came up with his stuff, he didn't actually add the negative punishment and positive punishment side to it. He just came up with positive and negative reinforcement at the very basic level.
Yeah. And didn't he say the punishment is the lack thereof positive reinforcement or something like that? Wasn't there something like that he had?
There's a whole debate there, and some argue that that's what he was trying to say.
Yeah.
But it's kind of hard to estimate really what he meant. He was really in favor of, or what he proposed really was that positive reinforcement is long-term better than punishment.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And so
of course
he ended up coming up with a lot of studies and stuff as well in jails, and coming up with token systems whereby jailmates could do work to get tokens and therefore show higher levels of productivity in the jail and higher levels of happiness and so forth.
Sure.
So he was actually technically kind of against punishment.
Yeah.
What I'm getting to though is technically, so to add to what you were saying earlier, and this is where it all gets really mishmashy. Mm-hmm. If we say, for example, negative punishment, my dog wants to jump up on me because I have a ball, but I want it to sit, right? Mm-hmm. And now I take the ball away. I negatively punish it by taking the ball away, and now it sits.
And then you give it to them.
And then I give it to them.
That's negative.
But I negatively punish them. But I
it's
also negatively reinforce them.
Yeah. Sure.
Right? So it's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like,
but isn't it? don't you have to look at some of those things as independent events, right? So like we're looking at it as a mesh, but isn't that two independent events? So that when you withhold the reward, obviously you're creating an aversive response, right? And that's punishing the act of jumping on you, obviously. Then you want the dog to sit, right? You maintain said aversive response, dog sits, and then pressure turns off, ball gets given to them, obviously. So that's also then, you can look at positive reinforcement. So in three, you're flipping between three different quadrants then at that point, all in one session, we'll say, right? Or one exercise, but it's still three individual things that you're doing, right?
But not under the guise of classical conditioning, because for a dog, if they rehearse that often enough, they say, well, I jump, ball gets removed, but then I sit and I get the ball. So that becomes classically conditioned. So then now it's one thing.
Yeah. Well,
right? So
what specifically gets classically conditioned then at that point?
That whole thing, that whole circuit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But, well, not necessarily, because what I'm assuming you're saying is that the act of taking a ball away becomes classically conditioned to sit to get the ball, but that would then defy the laws of negative punishment, because that event should be aversive enough where the dog wants to avoid it moving forward. So the dog should not continue to jump, so I need to take the ball away in the first place.
So let me give you another example.
Yeah.
I had a client who tried to do loose leash walking with her dog. And she got herself a prong collar, etc. And the dog would get to the end of the leash. She would mildly pop the dog at the end of the leash and then lure it back into a heel position.
Sure. With a treat or something, or
with a treat.
Yeah, got it.
And slowly but surely, the dog would go to the end of the leash,
sure,
on purpose.
It's a cue.
You trained a cue back.
Yes, you classically trained in a cue, right? So, but a lot of people would say, "Oh, that was negative reinforcement happening there." But was it? Because the dog wasn't motivated enough by the pressure at the end of the leash to want to escape or avoid it. They just started recognizing through classical conditioning that this non-aversive neutral event predicted being lured back in for a treat. Do you get what I'm saying?
But that's where it gets fishy, right? It's like, can we say whether it's sufficiently aversive or not? Maybe the dog just
it can
be.
We can, based on, do they learn to escape or avoid it in the future, right? If they're seeking it out, then it would not be something that is by definition aversive to them.
Which is what I want to get to eventually with this whole conversation on activation versus just classical negative reinforcement.
Yeah.
Is there potentially a place for a dog or an organism more generally to seek out mildly aversive events and shut them off on purpose as a reward intrinsically?
Sure. I mean, sure. Obviously, again, as Kiba said, with the freaking hot hands game, right? And I think in one of the articles you brought up about the leaving people in the room, by themselves, obviously, and they're bored out of their mind, being left with their thoughts was an aversive event in and of itself. So they started seeking out, applying electric stimulation. They had buttons that would obviously shock, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And they started doing that basically for fun to get their brain off of what was going on, where, again, this just gets to the conversation of just looking more deeply at what's happening in that moment. We would look at that and say they're seeking out an aversive, right? So dogs like aversives, and that's the way it works, or humans like aversive, and that's the way it works, and we could train it as activation. But in actuality, it's like the event of being left in the room by themselves for prolonged periods of time was more aversive, so it overrided the aversiveness of this. Do you get what I'm saying? Right?
Great point.
So it's like, same deal with, what was the example we were just using a minute ago of the leash, right? Hitting the end of the leash. We could argue that to some dogs, hitting the end of the leash on a prong collar and getting this really mild pop is aversive to them. And if that were the case, then they should ultimately stop doing that and start just seeking out, what do I do to get the reward, right? But to this dog you're describing, they were not averse to that. It was just a neutral sensation, right? Or maybe we could say mildly uncomfortable, I suppose.
Know. That's
right?
the hard thing, right?
But ultimately, not aversive enough to achieve positive punishment or negative reinforcement in that moment. So it was basically counter-conditioned or classically conditioned to be a cue to the dog, right? It turned into the example, like you said, of like you say no, the no is not inherently suppressive to the dog in that moment. So it becomes a signal for them to go do something else at that point, right?
Correct.
And that's what I argue with this whole e-collar activation stuff is like, I just did a podcast episode the other day on this Chris Alther guy who's becoming very popular right now, right? Yeah. And you'll see in the video, if you watched it, like he's stimming his dog repeatedly, right? And you see, it's not even like he's stimming it at a level that the dog doesn't perceive. He's stimming it where you see the neck muscle twitching. And everybody's like, if you look, the neck muscle is twitching. Look at the dog likes punishment, right? And it's like, I use the example of like, I could hit myself all day long, and sure, in some context that may be aversive to me, but like if I do it in a situation where it is not that aversive to me, and then I classically condition it or counter condition it to predict something good on the other end, it just turns into a cue or a signal then at that point, is the way I look at it. I don't see any debate of how it could be anything other than just a signal or a cue once you've gone through that process of turning it into a positive to the dog.
And that might well be the case. It might well be we just have to talk about semantics and be okay, well, this is actually a cue and it's not negative reinforcement necessarily.
Yeah.
Or we might just come up with something where we say, well, if you use the lower end of the spectrum of negative reinforcement plus classical conditioning, you could get something like activation. This is all stuff we can look into. Nonetheless, there is research about prolonged exposure over time and getting used to an aversive sensation that has been studied, and it shows that you can get used to pretty much anything, right? The classic, and I think it's the example that Ivan Balabanov uses in his podcast with Larry Crone, where he talks about the frog in the boiling water.
Yep.
Right, whether you put the frog in a pot and you slowly turn up the heat.
Yes.
How long until the frog realizes that it's boiling? Versus if you just drop the frog in the boiling water, it might just jump out right away, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing here. Like through all what we're talking about is also we always have to remind ourselves that all of these studies were done in isolation. Yep. They're in a vacuum. Same with Skinner. He did not use the same participant for all 4 quadrants, and not even to mention that he didn't use them for prolonged periods of time like we do with a dog. With one dog, we might go through all 4 quadrants in a couple of minutes even.
Sure.
Right? Like they'll live that whole experience. They might even live the whole spectrum, this so-called spectrum we're talking about of negative reinforcement and or positive punishment, all in one. They also have different cues. They might have been conditioned to one thing before or the other. We aren't even talking about like, how does the dog feel about the environment in which that is happening? So for example, is it different for a dog to be, let's say, positively punished? Say you have a sports dog and you go and you train in that field every day and you punish it in a field versus if you punish it on the street where it doesn't train so often.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Does that make a difference as well? All of these are considerations that we have to look into in terms of, well, what is actually happening in terms of quadrants? Does it neatly fit into all of those 4?
Yeah.
Or here's another one. You say you have a really amped up dog.
Yeah.
And it really wants to go say hi to another dog or something. And you're like, sit, and you pull up on the leash. You've basically negatively reinforced the sit. The dog is now sitting, but you've also made the dog want to go even more towards that dog simultaneously. So you've also technically positively reinforced the other dog, meaning your dog's perception of the other dog while negatively reinforcing it.
How so? Explain that one.
So for example, let's say in restrainment training in protection, right? I hold the dog back, and that is technically their cue, but it also is adding frustration to them because they want to go bite a decoy, for example, or they want to go to the toy or whatever it is. They understand that the more they fight into it, the quicker they're going to get released.
So that, I agree with you, obviously, right? So like when you're training protection dogs, you hold them back, you teach them to fight into the pressure, and then you build frustration, which obviously turns into some drive, right? Then you release them, and it makes them want to go more intensely towards it. But your example you gave was you see another dog, you tell your dog sit, you use negative reinforcement to get the dog into the sit. you're not teaching them to fight to get to the dog in that moment. You are teaching them to avoid the sensation to get into the sit.
Yeah.
Right.
But mentally, they're still thinking about going to that dog.
Sure. But does it make them want to get to it more in that moment? Because you're not adding in a frustration for them to fight into at that point. If anything, they've given into the opposite. They've given into the sit, obviously, in that moment. Right.
Physically.
Sure.
Right. But mentally. So, for example, this, I like, Has Ottman from Shield Canine.
Yes.
I like the way he sort of looks at the quadrants as well. He sort of says, well, if you, let's say you're in a heel and you negatively reinforce your dog because it broke the heel, it wanted to go say hi to another dog, you negatively reinforce it back into the heel. Will that dog try to do it again or not? Right? Mm-hmm. Versus if the dog leaves, punish it for leaving. Mm-hmm. And now will it try to do it again? And how long does that gap last? What I've noticed, depending obviously on how motivated your dog is, with certain dogs, if you, again, negatively reinforce them into a sit, for in this case, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, it does mean for sure that you got the sit. That's getting reinforced, obviously. But you still haven't solved in this case, the reactivity. The dog still wants to go there. It's just sitting. Mm-hmm. And if you then follow that up with, okay, now the dog actually sat for 1 second, got up, and try to go again, and you punish it, now you did what you should have done from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's two different expectations, right? So like you're using negative reinforcement to achieve the sit. This gets back to my whole point of like, I don't really use obedience necessarily to solve behavioral issues. I think the dog reactivity one is
I don't think most good dog trainers don't do that.
Yeah,
by the way, huh?
Sure.
But like, if we're just talking for talking's sake,
yeah,
you would think, okay, I'm gonna pull up on the leash and my dog's gonna sit and it's not gonna go.
You're communicating different expectations, right? So in one case, you're telling the dog clearly, don't do this thing, which sure, they would be less likely to do it in the future. In the other example, you're telling them, do this thing instead. But the second you release them from that, they're technically free to then make the decision of going back and trying to do the thing they were doing prior to that, right? The only exception, I think, to that would be, like you said, if I use negative reinforcement to enforce a heel after the dog tries to go to another dog, will the dog try to do it again moving forward? Well, it depends how motivated they are to try to escape that sensation moving forward, right? It depends. Are you using it as a punishment or as a reinforcement at that point? Because let's say we're just using it to reinforce the sit. I say sit, as long as the dog sits, no pressure happens, obviously. Yeah, you're going to be in this constant cycle of they sit, and then as soon as they're released, they try to do it again. Then you say sit, they sit. Then as soon as you release them, they try to go do that thing again. Case in point example, playing ball with a dog, right? Just because I tell them drop it in that moment and they drop it for me right there and then, they will still every single time go chase that ball again when I go to throw it once I give it back to them. There's nothing aversive about it in that moment. But let's say I'm using it as what a lot of people think is negative reinforcement, but punishment, which is we're out on a walk. I tell the dog sit, obviously. Excuse me. We're out on the walk. Dog sees another dog. They try to go for the other dog. I engage negative reinforcement, say sit, turn pressure off when they sit. And I do that every time because the sensation happens prior to, and they must be motivated by it in order for it to be negative reinforcement. Technically, I believe that would deter them from going off and doing other things. But like, and now I'm talking through this obviously out loud. Technically still, though, it's not communicating anything about the dog, so it's not going to reduce them going after the dog. What it's going to reduce is them doing anything other than sitting in that moment, right?
So aren't you technically engaging in capping?
Would you give me your definition of capping here? Because I don't generally use that word a whole lot.
What do you or how would you use it? So I don't mix it up.
Capping to me, the only time I've ever utilized the word capping, and this is by no means a scientific definition of it, right? But the only time I've ever used the term capping is like when you're talking about utilizing pressure, like I always use like chasing versus capping, right? So capping being starting at a level that the dog is motivated enough by in that moment where it's more motivating than the thing is the dog is trying to get to, right? Where chasing would be constantly always being slightly under what is needed in order to get the dog to be motivated enough by it.
see
So
what-
I use it in that term, but like I said, that's
Got it.
not like any type of like recognized scientific definition, obviously. So you can go ahead and tell me what you mean by that.
So I wasn't going in that direction at all. I was talking about capping in the sense of, so for example, let's say I'm playing with a flirt pole.
Yeah.
Right. And my dog is chasing it actively. It's super engaged, and I tell it down right before it gets to get the prey in this sense, right?
Sure.
And it downs super quick, and because it downs super quick, I release it again to go chase the flirt pole. What I ended up doing is I cap that behavior. I cap all that energy that is being used for the chase, and I bring it into the down so I can get a faster down, right?
Sure.
Aren't you then doing the same when, for example, your dog is just super amped to go whatever? Like, here's a funny example, and I know my clients struggle with this as well. When I show up to the sessions, their dogs are well trained already, and they cannot, for the life of them, sit when I show up to say hi to them. And I obviously am not trying to pet them or anything, but the dogs are like, "Fuck, I want to go say hi to him."
Yeah.
You know. And so either we have to constantly reinforce them to remain in that sit, right? But the desire to come say hi to me is way stronger than their desire to sit or listen to the prong collar in this case, let's say, right? So we're technically, by making them sit, we are capping, in my definition of capping, their desire for the thing, in this case, me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. And I think if we weren't using aversives, yeah, I mean, we could utilize the strong desire to get to the person, right? By making them do something first, and then they could get to it, and then you could channel all that drive into doing that thing. I think this is where, again, a lot of force-free trainers have utilized before, like, oh, just use the fucking grandma principle. I think they call it the Premack principle. Isn't that kind of the
Grandma principle? I like that one.
Yeah. Isn't that? I think they call it that because like grandma makes you eat your green beans before you have your fucking dessert.
I hadn't heard that one before.
Yeah. Somebody told me that one time. But anyways, Premack principle, right? Isn't that an example
Yeah.
of the Premack principle? Is you're telling them you got to do this first to achieve this. So if we were not using aversives, 100%. I would say that is exactly the case, is that you are utilizing, obviously, the desire to get to this thing or by doing this. But that also only works if you give them the opportunity to get to that strong reinforcement then on the back end, where in the example that we're using of out on the walk when we see another dog, there's, at least the way I train, never going to be a circumstance in which I let the dog then go up to the other dog. So I don't think that would fully apply there. I think initially, obviously, there's a lot of frustration involved. We make them sit in that moment. Obviously, they really want to get to it, so it's hard for them to do so, but they will never be reinforced by then, once they sit properly, going to get to that thing. Therefore, they will never want to get to it more intensely than moving forward. Do you get what I'm saying?
So what you're saying is at some point extinction kicks in.
Yeah, I mean, extinction, or, obviously in the way that I train these types of things, because on the walk is the one place I do add structure, obviously, and structure in the form of commands, obviously, in order to kind of prevent the dog from doing some other things. Because I don't like correcting dogs for just approaching other dogs independently, because I don't see the action of approaching another dog inherently as a bad thing. Right? Dogs are social creatures, obviously. Socializing with other dogs isn't an issue. So I don't necessarily see it fair to just, my dog goes up to a person, they're not in command, they're free to do what they want to do, I'm just going to correct them for it. My dog goes up to a dog, they're not in command of anything, I'm going to give a correction for it. That is a case I will manage it with an obedience command and say, hey, right now I'm asking you to do this, so you're not allowed to go engage with those types of things. Do you get what I'm saying? But again, the way I train, I utilize aversives in order to then maintain that. So I don't use the drive of the other dog, or I'm not trying to cap in that moment as you're describing. I am going to basically say, whether I'm using negative reinforcement or whether I'm using positive punishment, I'm asking a sit right now. If this distraction is too much for you, I'm either going to use a subjectively strong enough negative reinforcement in order to get you to want to escape or avoid this sensation by staying in this sit position, or I'm going to apply punishment for breaking that sit command, obviously, in order to make sure that you stay in that sit better moving forward than at that point. So I don't know. I don't know what I was necessarily answering there, but yeah, I think it's a little different. 'Cause you were asking, what is it capping, right? I don't think it's capping per your definition of it for that reason.
Simply because it's not going to be reinforced afterwards.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Got it. Now, I was sort of like trying to pick into the idea of whether whether negative reinforcement always does exactly what we think it should do also.
Sure.
Right. So even though in your case, and you described it really well, temporarily you might see frustration, and temporarily you
Yes.
might see that negative reinforcement isn't necessarily doing what it's doing until it hasn't. And that's why I asked, until extinction kicks in, because if it has still been reinforced.
Yes. Okay, I get where you're going with this. And let me just add another piece of clarity. This is funny. This kind of goes in this direction because a lot of people, when we show videos of working with dog reactive dogs, for example, right? A lot of people do one of two things. They either say, oh, well, you haven't solved anything because the dog emotionally is still in this state of frustration, which is kind of like what you're saying, right? Though you've said sit, have you solved the problem yet? Because the dog still really wants to lunge and react and go towards that dog in that moment, which I agree with, obviously. In that moment, it is not solved yet. It's managed in that case, but it's in the it's trending in the direction of being solved, because then over time, as the dog keeps themselves under control, we're not reinforcing the behavior by teaching them to fight into the leash by getting to the trigger like historically they've done in the past.
Correct.
There are consequences for not keeping themselves under control. And they realize, in addition to keeping myself under control, in addition to there be consequences for not keeping myself under control, and in addition to that, I never actually get to that thing I want to get to, then you start to see the overall state of mind shift, right? So
And that takes time, right? That has to technically
that takes a little bit more time. Yeah.
Yeah, it has to be conditioned, right?
Yeah, because in some cases, obviously, you either have the frustration of I just want to get to the dog, and then extinction needs to take place where it's like they realize they're just not going to get to the other dog, or in some cases, you have the fear-based reactivity response, which is I'm scared of the other dog. I think something really bad is going to happen, like this dog is going to run up and attack me, so I'm proactively going to keep that threat away. Then you have to have them experience that situation many times where I don't even know if this would be an example of extinction or not, but they start to or just desensitization, I should say, where dogs go by, they keep themselves under control and nothing bad happens. And then again, that fear response gets less and less and less, where they don't feel like they need to be reacting, right?
I think technically speaking, in the case of a fear reactive dog, that would be more so counter conditioning.
Would it be counter conditioning, just experiencing it and nothing bad? I guess it could be, right?
So
I don't actually know.
I'm looking at my notes here, and there's this concept called discriminative stimulus control, right?
Elaborate on that.
So discriminative stimulus is a stimulus that signals the availability of reinforcement when a specific behavior is performed. For example, here's a human example. Green traffic light signals that pressing the gas pedal will be reinforced, right?
Okay.
Versus what will be then called the S delta is a stimulus that signals the absence of reinforcement, meaning that the behavior is less likely to occur. So, for example, in this case, a red traffic light would mean pressing the gas pedal might actually get you killed, so don't do that, right?
Sure.
If you have a reactive dog that's just frustration reactive, right? Just a dog who wants to go play with other dogs and it gets frustrated because it's on leash, etc. Since it has been reinforced in the past, that is just an ST, right? It's been reinforced in the past, and therefore it's a stimulus that signals potential reinforcement, right?
Seeing the dog, you're saying, right?
Seeing the dog, and maybe if I go there, I might get to actually play with the dog itself.
Understood.
Versus over time, if it doesn't get reinforced, or if we show the dog that, hey, that's just not going to happen. Like, let's say, for example, we raised a new puppy from day 0, and it does not get to interact with dogs on the walk. Dogs on the walk are already an S delta, technically, meaning there's no
it's the red light
possibility there.
It's the red light in that. Okay, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I kind of like that. So basically, you're shifting it, right? And historically, in the past, it's a green light to the dog, right? And then you're shifting it to be a signal of there's nothing there for you, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I like that.
And I mean, technically, we do this all the time. This is what was it called again? I think I sent you this on Instagram before I sent you that one final email with all the stuff inside of it.
Yeah.
It was Dr. Stuart Hilliard talking about extinction. And what's the other word? Oof. Man, all these terms.
I know.
Basically, like your non-reinforcement marker, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to get rewarded now. for XYZ behavior. So for example, dog, I'm stationary. I tell dog to come in heel, but it comes in crooked. I say, nope, try again.
Yeah.
That's a non-reinforcement marker. Right?
How do you see the difference between, so non-reinforcement markers versus negative punishment markers? I will say always.
Same.
Okay, you view them as the same?
Yeah, okay. Same.
I've seen some trainers, I believe, try to explain that they're different things. I think one in particular, I think Gary Wilkes had an article talking about, because Gary Wilkes is the big guy on markers, obviously. He trains yes, no, wrong. Or sorry, he trains click, no, wrong. Those are his big three, right? And click, obviously, is his positive reinforcement marker. No is his negative marker, his punishment marker, if you will. And then wrong, I asked him one time, I was like, is that just a marker for negative punishment? And he told me no, but I can't remember his exact logic behind it. And ever since he told me no, when he said that, I've always second guessed myself a bit on like, wait a minute, non-reinforcement markers, are they something different than negative punishment markers?
I don't think so because, for example, where I'm at right now, the studio where we're filming this in right now, the owners or the people who lent me the studio are ex-clients of mine and really good friends of mine. And their dog, for example, if you tell it it's non-reinforcement marker too often in a session, he gets so, I can't do it. I don't want to do it anymore. Like which there's also studies showing that actually negative punishment might actually be a bit more aversive than say, an e-call.
No, I've seen the studies on that before.
Yeah. In the case of this dog particularly, if you tell him, no, you're not going to get reinforced, even though you're trying, it's as if you go to work every day and your boss is like, yeah, you're not getting paid. You might shoot yourself in the head if you do that enough, right? You're like, fuck, man. So can't win.
Yeah, no, 100%. So as we're approaching the last, we'll say 20, 30 minutes of this or so, I really want to hone everything into maybe a couple points people can take away from stuff. Because, like I said, I had no idea really where the direction this conversation was going to go. And honestly, it doesn't feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a whole lot we've really disagreed on so far. It's really more so been just talking through some of these concepts and understanding them a bit more deeply, obviously, and kind of giving people some tactical examples of how things can flow a little bit more. And I think, for me, the takeaway I like people to have from conversations like this, though they might be a little exhausting to kind of listen to sometimes and like follow along, like it does challenge you mentally a little bit, obviously, as you're like digging through all the nuances of it, is just to think a little bit more deeply about what does your dog actually care about, right? I think we create these pictures in our head of like, my dog should like these things. These things should be reinforcing to dogs. These things should be punishing for dogs, et cetera, et cetera. And they get really locked into this framework where they're looking at it from the lens of them and not from the lens of their dog in that moment. And especially if we're going to use things like traditional learning theory, you have to really, really make sure that you're looking at it from your dog's perspective in order to understand kind of what it is that they're actually caring about to make your training as efficient as possible and make sure your dog learns as efficiently as possible, obviously. I'm interested to hear, as we talk through this, any places that you feel like, as we're thinking through these stuff, of like different ways we need to start looking at learning theory, anything I might still be missing from what we've talked about so far as an area that like there isn't enough clarity on still or anything like that. I'm curious to kind of hear your opinion on that.
There's one thing I want to jump back to real quick that I just remembered. Because the last portion of the conversation was about whether things are going to get reinforced positively or not, like in the case of going to a dog, for example. And I mentioned, like, in my case, that I have dogs that struggle to sit when they come to the class because they want to interact with me, right?
Yeah.
Because they will eventually be handled by me at some point.
100%.
Right? So,
yeah.
So there we shoot ourselves in the foot, right? So technically, I shouldn't even be touching the dog if I would really want it to just sit.
It depends, right? Like another example is people coming over the house, right? Like I make my dogs hold a bed stay when I have people come over the house, not because they're doing anything wrong if they're not in command, but it's like, people don't like dogs being under their foot when they're walking in, trying to take their shoes off and this and that. But again, I used to use, people ask me all the time, well, here's a big one to that point, right? I put my dog in a bed stay when people come over, and then I release my dogs from the bed stay, and they are just so fucking intense about wanting to get to the people, and people don't know how to handle that situation, right? And the way I always describe that is this is where you get into like learning nature versus nurture, right? Like learning theory versus like genetics, all that kind of stuff. We have
and just practical life.
Practical life.
Just,
yeah, 100%.
Right?
Like this is, it all kind of ties together here where it's like there's two ends of the spectrum where we could say just reinforce the bed command, right? But like that's not changing the emotional state of mind in that moment.
Correct.
Because again, at some point they're going to get released and they're going to go up to these people. So we as trainers have to look at not just how do I enforce my commands? How do I use my punishment? How do I use my rewards? But what is creating a lot of this stuff in the first place? And this is just dog training 101 here is like, because the force-free community puts so much emphasis on like you're not addressing the underlying cause of things, I think a lot of times balanced dog trainers take that and they just throw it out the window. They're like, they actually don't focus on the underlying cause of things that much because they're saying, oh, the solution is focus on the it's almost like this like give and take of like, oh, fuck you, you're going to tell me I have to focus on that too much, so like I'm not even going to pay any attention to it kind of thing, right? But it's like we have to do a good job of like we're going to create control and we're going to use aversives and we're going to teach these behaviors and all this kind of stuff, but we have to look at the underlying cause in that moment. So if there's a situation like the dog coming to the training class that's gonna interact with you eventually, right? Or people coming over the house and the dog is gonna interact with them eventually, if we're having problems with the dog getting too intense about going to them, we just have to be mindful of what's causing that in the first place, which in many cases starts with what's happening and why is that trigger you, the guest coming over, so reinforcing to the dog in that moment. And we address that side of things, right?
And I'd add, you could, and this is something I learned from Stuart Hilliard. He would say, if it's that reinforcing and there's already a high degree of reinforcement history, it's almost inextinguishable under punishment.
Yeah, right? For sure. Yeah.
There are behaviors that are so reinforced or have been reinforced and are so internally reinforcing that you cannot punish them. And you might as well, even in the case of like, let's say you have a Dutch Shepherd and it really wants to go bite the decoy and now you're trying to punish it for not healing, it might just bite you back, right? Mm-hmm. So what would you do there is you add another layer of learning on top of it. So for example, and then going back to the pre-MAC thing.
Yeah.
So let's say dog is in a place board. People come into the house. Dog is complying with the place board, doesn't move, all good. And before I send it there, I have another marker. So before I send it to the people, I have another marker, which means come play ball with me.
Yeah,
come play
sure.
Ball on string, right? So now I release the dog from the place board, but to ball on string first.
Yeah.
And I can get rid of all that pent up stuff, which is again that capping thing, right? And now I can play with my dog real quick, get it a bit more mellow, and now we're done with the training, with the ball play stuff. And now you can go say hi to the rest of the people.
Yeah. So you're just dispersing.
Right?
You're dispersing the reinforcement, if you will. It sounds like kind of at that point, where instead of it being honed in on one single thing, it's kind of dispersed amongst a couple of different things. So it's not quite as intense, right? Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
To an extent, right? Or also something I like from a trainer I've been working with here in Barcelona. He and I think he learned a lot of this from, he's worked with Nino Drovart and a lot of the like Mike Jones, for example, like the guys from the Canine Street League stuff. And he mentions a lot about how dogs like to be in control at all times. Mm-hmm. And if you look at like Nino's new work with his 3 styles of healing, it's all about where the focus is. Right? Mm-hmm. And this is something in sports that we do a lot is like, well, the decoy is there, but can you take food from me? Mm-hmm. For example, right? Just because the decoy is there doesn't mean you can't take food from me or that you can't play ball with me, even though the decoy is there. And we work a lot on this sort of stuff in field because at the end of the day, we want both neutrality and non-neutrality with the decoy.
I 100% understand what you're saying. Wouldn't that still to some extent involve the thing the dog is so excited about, us actively working to make it slightly less exciting though? right? So like in order, let's say you had a dog that didn't take food around the decoy, right? Wouldn't you have to an extent for a week, however long it takes, right? For a week or so in the presence of the decoy, show the dog you're not going to get to bite that thing right now until you calm down a little bit and focus on me a little bit more and take these treats in this moment, right? So wouldn't it still kind of involve doing that to some extent?
Very much so.
And you're using the you playing the ball with the dog when people come over, or giving the treats around the decoy or whatever, almost as your barometer of how good of a job you've done with decreasing the reinforcement of that thing, right? Is it that your reinforcement that you had that you were providing, you made so reinforcing that it outweighed the reinforcement of the decoy over there, or was it that you made the decoy less reinforcing enough where this was then reinforcing enough to them? Do you get what I'm saying? Like, which one is moving?
So there's funny that you bring this up. There's a dilemma in extrinsic and intrinsic motivation as well, whereby I can't remember the name of the effect, but let's say you really like, let's say you like dancing a lot, right? And you do it as a hobby, and now you're becoming famous for dancing, and you start getting paid for dancing, and now you fucking hate it.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah,
Right?
yeah, I've heard that before. And that's where they talk about dogs that like to do things in some cases. The second you start adding a paycheck to it, so you start positively reinforcing them with treats or something like that, it actually makes it less engaging and fun for the dog to perform the behavior because they want this thing now instead of this thing, right?
Right. And so in human psychology, the way to address that is you reward for effort, not for, what's the word? You reward for effort, not for performance.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yes.
So you like dancing. Good on you for practicing. Right? Versus, yeah, you're a good dancer. Here's your money.
Yeah. So here's my not to interrupt you, but like my question to that is almost exactly the same. In order for that to be true, wouldn't you have to be more motivated by the money than you are by the dancing? Do you get what I'm saying?
Repeat that.
In order for that
you might
to
need
be
to elaborate a bit more.
Yeah. So, okay. So you really like dancing, right? You do it for free all the time. You do it just because it's fun. You like doing it, right? But then you start getting paid for doing it. And getting paid is very reinforcing to you, right? Obviously. I mean, like, you know, and
ideally. I mean, there's people who would argue like I just dance because I want to dance, right?
But obviously, once you realize there's an opportunity to make a living off of this, obviously getting paid is very reinforcing to you, right? Or in the case of a dog performing a behavior they like, and then they start getting a reward, they probably need to really like getting that reward, right? So because of that, the emphasis of what they're motivated by in their head starts shifting to the treats, where this becomes more reinforcing than this does. But in order for that to be the case, doesn't the thing that they're getting, so the paycheck if you're a human, or the reward if you're the dog, technically need to be more reinforcing to the dog than the behavior was reinforcing in and of itself? Does that make sense?
Ooh, I see what you're saying. So if I could probably draw it for you real quick. It goes something like this. So let's say this is intrinsic, and this is X. Let's see. Can you see that from there? So it's this.
Yes. Yeah, got
right?
it.
Intrinsic, extrinsic.
Yes.
So the more we go towards extrinsic, the lower intrinsic becomes, and it takes over.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Can you define the two for me?
So intrinsic means, like in very, very, very simple terms, intrinsic means comes from within.
Sure.
Motivation comes from within. Extrinsic means
comes from outside.
From outside, right? From external factors.
Yeah.
In context of what we're talking about, that's why we started at behaviorism. Skinner, for example, who took behaviorism to the next level, so his behaviorism was actually called radical behaviorism. He believed that no matter what, organisms are more so extrinsically motivated than intrinsic, and he didn't even care about intrinsic.
So that's exactly the point that I made, right? So like the paycheck that you receive, right, is more reinforcing than the intrinsic reinforcement of performing the behavior, right? Is that like what we're kind of assuming here to some extent? So because of that, since you're constantly in, what do they say? Comparison is the thief of joy or whatever, right? Because you're putting them in a position then where they're receiving two types of reinforcement, intrinsic and extrinsic. You get what I'm saying, whatever. Between those two, right? This one is more reinforcing than this one. So because they're being compared side by side in your head, you're going to start to view this one as less reinforcing than you viewed it before.
That's what the studies claim.
Okay. Yeah. 100%.
That's what the studies claim.
Yeah.
For sure. And that's why I made the distinction. If you're getting paid for results versus if you're getting paid for like in more so what was it what I said earlier? I missed out. If you get paid for results, you will inevitably become more extrinsically motivated. But if you're paid for effort, you're going to get more intrinsically motivated on the counter side to that.
How does that work though? Because you're still getting rewarded from the
You're still getting
outside,
reinforced,
right? From the outside.
But in that case, you're not messing so much with what you provide, and this is why I said in the human example, that's where that lives. If I get paid for my effort, then I just put more effort.
I understand what you're saying.
It has nothing to do with dancing at that point. You know what I mean?
Yes. Okay, that makes sense to me. So basically, what we're saying is, let's say using really simple examples, a dog really likes to sit, right? And sitting is, for whatever reason, really intrinsically reinforcing to a dog, right? And you do that all day. If you start rewarding for sits, you're comparing the two rewards. They're receiving two rewards at the same time, basically, the intrinsic reward and the extrinsic reward, right? And you're comparing them, and you're going to kill the intrinsic one, right? Essentially, right? Eventually, right? But if you reward for effort, so over the course of an entire training session of doing sits, when you start to get ones where the dog is performing it with a ton of enthusiasm, you reward for that, then it's not getting in the way of it. So because they're still getting reinforced the majority of the time intrinsically, but the external reward that you're providing doesn't really directly correlate to the thing that they're getting intrinsically rewarded by. Am I understanding this correctly?
If I had to pick that apart, I would only pick apart that I don't think dogs calculate speed. I don't think they.
I don't either.
I think you can.
I don't either.
You can only prep them for that.
So
you can only set up a scenario for that. So in my case, what I would say effort would be, for example, let's say you have your dog in a sit and you have a flat collar on it, and you're trying to pull it down so it would go into a down, but it fights back and it remains in the sit.
Okay. Yeah. So you're doing something to test then the sitting at that point. It's not for the sit necessarily, but it's for commitment to the sit.
It's the
even
fight
in the face
for the
of. Okay, I got it. So would you see that as an example of giving reinforcement for a? How do you how? I have a hard time connecting that it's the reinforcement is not still for just the sit, though. You know what I'm saying?
No, I'm not saying it isn't.
Yeah.
If the dog fights for it, for example, this is where the quadrants would be kind of jumbled up. So let's say I have my dog in a down and I start pulling up.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It should just get up because it's been taught leash pressure or whatever.
Sure.
But I'm here in this case trying to make it fight against the pressure.
Oppositional reflex.
And the pressure will only turn off, exactly, oppositional reflex. The pressure will only turn off the harder you fight.
Yeah.
And that's where stuff gets interesting, because now isn't negative so it's like the dog is actively aiming to turn off the aversive to get rewarded by fighting. But fighting, not escaping necessarily.
But are they?
But
they are kind of still escaping, though, right? Like, because you're trying to reinforce a particular extent of fighting, right? So they're turning. They are learning. I could turn off this pressure. I could escape this pressure by maintaining this sit right now, right? So this is where again, and like I said. The whole activation conversation, we could probably do a whole nother fucking podcast talking specifically just on that. But like that is, I don't see how that is still anything other than just an example of negative reinforcement, right? Or a cue, right? Like you're testing it with just It's not an aversive in that moment. Like a flat collar, honestly, pulling on it, we would have to determine, are we using a prong collar, are we using a flat collar? Is the dog averse by it? Is the dog non-averse by it? Is it neutral? Is it aversive, right? But like,
so most trainers won't use a prong collar for this, for example,
of course,
because they want the prong collar to be followed, right?
Yeah, of course, obviously, right? Yeah, anytime I've done historical, like we used to do some of this stuff with our positions in Mondioring, right? So when we were doing that on a flat collar, the sensation isn't aversive to the dog, right? But we're teaching them to fight that pressure still at that point. Or I don't even want to say fight that pressure. We are teaching them just to stay committed to the thing that they're doing and ignore that pressure, basically, right? So I don't necessarily see that as activation, no different than you know what I mean? Like, because they're not like averse to that sensation at all.
To all of this, we actually have yet to define what activation is for us. Huh?
Yeah. Right.
But to finalize this point, I would say if we look at the classic definition of escape and avoidance, it doesn't quite neatly fit into it anymore. If we say fight, yes, sure, it's turning off so-called aversive or minimally aversive sensation.
Yeah.
It's turning it off and it's doing a job and it's getting reinforced on top of it.
Well,
but it's not escaping
per
se as per definition, you know what I mean?
And now talking through it, technically when you're doing that type of training, the turn off isn't doing anything, right? Like you could technically, we're just teaching a sit and we're proofing it with a bit of opposition then at that point. Technically, I could sit there and I could maintain, like when we would do this and change of positions because the dog needs to stay over there and not forge towards us when we're doing sit down stand. Right?
Correct.
Whatever. Yeah. So we'd have a long line on a flat collar. We would put the dog into a sit. We would pull on that collar, obviously, where it was fair, not where we're going to strong arm the dog out of the position, but we'd pull on the collar and see if the dog maintains committed to the sit, right? Technically speaking, and a lot of times it's like, all right, then you stop, you go reinforce the dog, you do it again. You stop, you go reinforce the dog, then you do it again. But honestly, where you turn the pressure off is kind of irrelevant. Like you could sit there and because you're just training sit, I could just sit there and hold pressure, say sit, good. Forever. Pressure stays on, go reward. Yeah. Stand, right? Like pressure stays on, go reward, down, right? Like, and I could keep doing that. So that wouldn't even be, it's just a distraction then. That isn't really that there is nothing for it to even fit into from a quadrant standpoint then at that point.
That's exactly my point.
Right?
Exactly my point. Yeah.
So I guess if you wanted to do that with e-collar pressure, the only difference is I don't even see how, and not that I think you're trying to directly correlate that to what people are doing with the e-collar with activation, but like the e-collar is different because it's a sensation, but it's not moving the dog in any particular way. Sure, you could use it as a distraction, right? Which is what I was kind of implying that I thought that Chris Alther guy was doing, which is like, we're teaching you just to literally ignore this, right? Whatever I'm asking you to do, just keep doing it. This isn't doing shit. It's just there as a distraction for you to ignore then at that point, which like...
I'd be super curious to really meet the guy and,
me too.
And actually see what it's about.
I know. I wanted to. I invited him on the podcast like 3 times prior to doing that episode because I didn't want it to be this like I'm trying to like rip you apart or like make fun of your methods or anything because I do respect the work the guy's doing, but it's just I wanted to be able to like really ask some follow-up questions of like what is it actually doing? You know what I mean? Like what do you think that it's accomplishing in that moment so we could kind of pick it apart a bit more and maybe find some some common ground on it, obviously.
And that was a topic I thought we might talk a bit more about during our podcast as well was the and we talked a little bit about this back and forth was the overutilization of marketing in our current system of dog training persona, let's say, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to speak for the guy, but I can understand why he wouldn't come on to your podcast because he's like, oh, I'm just going to get torn apart.
Sure.
Right? Because that's bad PR for him, right? Even though at the end of the day, we don't really know what he's trying to say. He might as well just come on, right? But it's the same. It's like what I saw the other day and like not to bring anything up. I don't want more beef. But I hope you didn't see like Nino and what's his name, Eric and Capri, this guy on Instagram. They had this back and forth.
I didn't see it
because because Eric was he was correcting some dog who had 3 legs for pulling.
Yeah,
and then Nino came on and he's like, I would never do that to a dog and sort of like saying how his methodology is better.
Yeah,
and making more PR for his methodology, which I mean, fair enough, it's great methodology, and so is Eric's. You know what I mean? So when we get to that point of like we're all dog trainers, we're all trying to do the same thing. and we're just getting into semantic discussions of like, oh no, I'm activating versus I'm doing this versus I'm being friendly to the dog and he
Yeah.
doesn't feel it. It's like,
The
man,
the difference to me always comes into like when you see I don't like getting into conversations with people or debates with people about whose application of certain methods is better because it is so like it's so subjective. You know what I mean? It's like better for what? Better for whose life? But you know what I mean? Like what the debates that I like to have with people are the ones when people are claiming that the things they are doing fall outside of the realms of traditional learning theory, right? And obviously, as we talked about today, traditional learning theory is more complex than some people give it credit for, but I still haven't heard an example in which something truly does not fit at all within learning theory. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's more of an art to it than people give it credit for as far as the
oh,
application of the
definitely.
methods
Yeah.
and how things can kind of change. And in one circumstance, it's this, and in another circumstance, it's this. But I think in a lot of cases, people try to act like something's happening that truly just doesn't make sense or fit within that, you know, and that's how this whole conversation was sparked with the whole activation
And I mean,
thing.
fair enough, right? It's hard to, and
Yeah.
even me, I have like all these notes in front of me, and I'm struggling to like find the definitions and all this stuff too.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like
yeah, sure.
even if you have studied it, it's not like it just comes naturally to know all of the definitions and how it practically works. Come
Yeah.
up with the best example that fits every perspective, and be able to deliver that in a marketable sense.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Right,
for
that's
sure.
hard. It's hard on its own. Like how can you, and even then, like how can you go against the status quo if someone comes out and says, ah, Skinner's quadrants don't work?
Yeah.
Well, how are you going to prove that? It's
Yeah,
hard. You
sure.
can't just say that.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know
Yeah.
On that note, something I think could, so one part of the thing I wanted to talk about you with is, and I think I sent this to you on the email as well, is like how much can we remold per se the quadrants? That's one part of the question, and then two, how much can we take from other areas of psychology that are mainly applied to humans and maybe apply them to dogs instead, right? One of the things I've been looking into and seeing if it doesn't fit a bit more neatly, not that they would be separate, but that we could sort of bring together is self-determination theory. So self-determination theory is basically it highlights autonomy, competence, and relatedness in shaping learning and motivation, right? So in this case, autonomy is the idea. So let me just read here, let's do this. I'll read the definition for you real quick, and then we go through those three and we can see if they fit. So self-determination theory is a psychological framework that explores human motivation, emphasizing the role of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in behavior. It was developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan in 1985. And SDT, or self-determination theory, posits that individuals are naturally inclined toward growth and self-improvement when their three basic psychological needs are met, right? And that leads us to autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy talks about the need to feel in control of one's actions and choices.
Yep.
Competence, the need to feel effective and capable in interactions with the environment. And relatedness, the need to feel connected to and valued by others. I could definitely see
What was the third one? What was the third one?
Relatedness, the need to feel connected to and valued by others.
Okay.
So I could definitely see how this could fit in to dog training, right?
sure.
So for example, autonomy is, like we were talking at the beginning, freedom of choice within a structure.
Yeah.
And then directly correlated, competence. So for example, and this is something I saw Nino talking about, he talked about this with Larry Crone in a podcast as well. Because I think Larry asked him like, oh, exactly about this, about activation. And Nino was like, wait, before we even talk about activation, how fast does your dog come into a command? Does it have the technical know-how to get into a position with ultra speed, right? So for example, that's where I look at sort of anatomy, manufacturing, luring so that the dog comes in quicker to the behavior before we even add pressure.
Yep.
Then we start adding maybe slight bits of pressure in the luring as well. How do we maximize the body position of a dog to come into the best position possible? So that's why I was asking earlier with the contact heel. Is it better for the dog to contact with its neck? Probably not, because it's contacting with its neck going into the leg, which makes its hind end go the other way.
Yep.
So in essence, maybe it'd be better for the dog to contact with its shoulder so it can have its head straight so that it can also have its back end straight, which then when you walk backwards makes it easier for him to walk backwards, right?
Yep.
So that's, again, competence. And then relatedness is to feel connected to and valued by others. And that's where we as handlers have to do a good job of just being proactive with our dogs and not suppressing them, right? Like our language to them makes a huge difference. If we're reinforcing with our voice, for example, or our tone, we can make our dogs happier to do the work, for example, versus if we're just there quietly, like, well, do the work. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And this tied in with the quadrants as well.
Yeah. And some of those things are hard to coach, because like the last one you described, it's not about using a different tone of voice. It's not about, moving in a particular way with a dog or like any of those types of things. It's just about like, this is going to be the most like a woo woo thing that I feel like I've ever said, but like it's really just about like truly being connected with the animal you're working with, engaging like when you do different things, how does the dog respond to those different things? You know what I mean? It's no different than like, when you're, like my wife and I, when we're interacting with each other, that we know how to interact with each other in a way that the other enjoys. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's the same with dogs, and it's not a particular set of behaviors you may do, but you have to feel like you actually understand your dog well enough to interact with them in a way that they're going to feel connected with you. You know what I mean? And that one, I feel it's probably impossible to coach because you just have to like trial and error and just connect with your dog by doing it,
You kind of, and I think because I've had this said to me in classes as well. It's like, oh, when you take the dog, it's like magic.
Yeah, sure.
And when I take the dog, I can't make it do shit. And I'm like, because I have the reps.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I've been putting in the work.
And I view some of these things a little bit different, right? Like, getting back to the very first thing you said, like brain and plus body, like, are they separate? Are they the same? Like, obviously, we could focus on physical things that we're doing and expectations we're holding our dog to. And an issue like what you just described, that isn't so much being connected with the dog. I don't think that's like causing the dog to behave better for you than it is for the clients. That's usually the physical things you're doing, right?
Yeah,
or the
more
physical
mechanics than anything.
That's the mechanics of how you're asking and enforcing commands. But past that, once you have a dog, like I'll look at like when I'm working a trained dog versus when I see another dog trainer working a trained dog, and we're both mechanically doing the same things. The dogs are responding compliantly and accurately to both of us, but the relationship, if you will, right? How the dog is engaging with you while it's doing those types of things can be completely different based on all of those other components of how you're delivering the information to the dog. Right. Correct. And that's where, like I said, it's like impossible to train it because it's like so much of it has to do with, what was the other thing? Competency, right? Competency of the handler. How competent are you in doing these things? The more competent you are and the more mindless you could be about how you're, influencing the dog through these mechanics, the looser you can be with them and the more you could be in tune with those types of things, where a less competent trainer has to focus a lot more on the mechanics of what they're doing, right?
Which also makes your dog slower.
Sure. Yeah. 100%.
Right? Which then would then make the dog look slower, which then you could technically assess and be like, well, no, the dog is suppressed, but it's just slow because you've been luring it slow, for example.
Yeah, for sure. So, no, 100%. But yeah, I like those points, obviously. And, the autonomy thing, obviously, the freedom to kind of make choices and stuff, I think is truly the most overlooked thing in dog training right now. I just think that like we as an industry have moved in this direction of just not letting dogs choose, right? And obviously we have to influence their choices, right? We have to make sure that we're there to guide and make sure they're making proper decisions, right? And some of that may come in management, some of that may come in punishment, some of it may come in reward, et cetera, et cetera. But man, if you can't position yourself to allow your dog to start making choices, you will never achieve what I feel is like true freedom with your dog, So, and then,
I think to add to that, like when we talk about operant dogs, right? I think you've maybe heard of this
for sure.
topic.
Yeah.
Well, basically what that means is the dog is in the matrix, so to speak. When the dog knows that there's consequences and there's a language around what they're doing, it already makes them competent.
Yeah.
Right? Because a dog that isn't trained, I had this the other day, they're like, it's just always mind-boggling to me, like taking a new client and doing just name work, like telling the dog its name
Yeah.
and just seeing the dog keep on walking. It's like, so it blows my mind every time. I'm like, oh shit.
Yeah.
That dog has absolutely no idea that there is even this whole game that we can play here.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not in the matrix. And a dog who, if trained correctly with the right language in terms of markers, cues, positive, negative, all this stuff, if it's trained correctly, you will make them smarter. Back to what I said at the very beginning. I like smart dogs. I like dogs to be in the matrix of my training so that they can make choices.
Yeah.
And therefore also raise the bar.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
Because like if you're working with a Mali, they kind of come sort of pre-manufactured to be smart. But if you are working with let's say a bully breed, they're not particularly quote unquote smart. But how do you maximize that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Man, I think we've hit on most of the important topics initially here. Like I said, I don't want to dwell too much into other things where we might need more time for it. I think this most likely is going to warrant a part 2 at some point. So we'll definitely probably try to plan for that. We'll see kind of how people like these types of conversations. Like I said, this is a real dog trainers conversation, right? Like, and I've listened to episodes like this that like Ivan's done before, like other people, where it's like real sciencey with stuff. And it's good, but like, it takes a little bit to digest. So I hope that if anything, like I said, there's not even any major learning points from this episode, aside from maybe starting to also ask yourself if you as a trainer are not capable of having conversations like this because you don't understand some of the nuances of the methodology that you're using, maybe start focusing on some of that a little bit more. I think that might be a really good takeaway from this, because as you know, like if I can understand the why behind some of the things I'm doing and why technically speaking it should or shouldn't be working, when I inevitably run into problems in my training later on, I'm going to be able to reverse engineer it and figure out what's going wrong. Where if you can't do it, you're always going to find places where you're going to get stuck and not know how to solve it. So I think just being able to discuss these types of things and start looking at the things you're doing and asking yourself the question of like, where does this fall within the spectrum of, science or learning theory or those types of things, I think is a really good starting place for people with this kind of stuff.
And I would add to that, if you've come up with, say the basic definitions or the basic framework, if you learn it all and it still doesn't quite make sense to you, come up with your own sort of system, but be able to explain it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's the next one, right? It's like, well, for me, for example, we could now spend another 2 hours talking about how I look at the quadrants.
Yeah.
And I could show you like my sort of diagram about that, but we're not going to do that because it's going to take us another 3 hours. But I can explain to you why I view why I think these quadrants are here versus there versus why these are cut in half. That's something for another podcast episode for sure. But I can explain that, right? And I try my best because I need to be able to explain that to my clients. That's my work, right? Like I'm also not trying to just have my clients comply with what I tell them to do without them knowing what to do. I want them to be able to eventually, if they have a new dog, that they don't call me, that they show off to me, that they're like, hey, look what I did. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I like it. Well, like I said, we'll put this episode out. This is going to come out probably Tuesday of next week. I'll send it to you once it's live and everything. And obviously feel free to use any clips or anything from it that you want. And then we'll see what people think about it. Like I said, if we get some interesting conversation in it, we'll definitely warrant a part 2 on it, and we'll dive a little deeper into stuff and kind of go from there and see what we get. But listen, I really appreciate you coming on. I really appreciate you reaching out in the first place to chat. For anybody listening to this, if you guys want to fucking talk dogs, send me a DM. I'll engage with you. We'll see if we got some interesting conversations to come up with.
He does, man. He responds back, and he responds with the proper intensity. He means what he says, and he's down for it. I like it.
So awesome,
super
man.
Super cool, man.
Thank
you for the opportunity.
So I mean, obviously you're in Spain. So are your training is all you're doing all your training over in Barcelona? Obviously, yeah.
For the time being, we're sort of starting to put together online programs, but gotta see where I put that.
Yeah, Cool.
Yeah,
And is
yeah,
everything just Merge Canine, like Instagram
Yep.
and all that?
Yep. There's only Instagram for the moment. YouTube coming up, hopefully sometime soon.
Cool.
And if you're in Barcelona or in Spain, watch out because we're gonna be doing some seminars soon. So like a
Nice.
seminar series.
Awesome.
Just trying to give away like what I think is basic information that everyone should know.
Yeah.
Right. So we're gonna be talking about quadrants. We're gonna be talking about where dog training comes from, this sort of stuff.
Cool. Well, listen, man, I enjoy it. We'll chat soon and see if we can make this happen again.
Fantastic, man. Thank you again for the opportunity. Really nice chatting with you.
Likewise. We'll talk to you soon.